Imagine a world where the earth is not a globe, but a vast, square expanse of land and river, centered beneath the watchful eyes of the heavens. In the final years of the 14th century, the air in the high mountain valleys of Yunnan is thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Far from the bustling coastal ports and the grand marble halls of the capital, a young boy named Ma He moves through the mountain shadows, unaware that his destiny is tied to the rhythmic pulse of an ocean he has never seen. In these quiet inland heights, the world feels permanent and unchanging, yet the very foundations of China are shifting beneath his feet like the slow turning of a great tide. The Ming Dynasty is in its infancy, rising like a phoenix from the ashes of the Mongol occupation. To the people of this era, China is the Middle Kingdom, the central pillar of civilization, surrounded by a world that seems to stretch endlessly toward the four corners of the compass. The first Ming Emperor, Hongwu, has reclaimed the throne for his people, and with this victory comes a renewed sense of order, tradition, and quiet pride. The landscape is being transformed as the scars of war are smoothed over by the planting of millions of trees and the careful restoration of ancient irrigation canals. There is a collective sigh of relief as the country settles into a period of introspection, looking inward to its own mountains and rivers for strength. The concept of the Middle Kingdom is more than just a name, it is a philosophy of balance. It is the belief that the emperor sits at the very heart of the universe, and all harmony flows outward from his palace like ripples on a still pond. In these early days of the Ming, the sea is often viewed with a sense of cautious mystery. It is a vast, blue void that marks the end of the known world, a place of unpredictable storms and forgotten islands. Yet, even as the empire looks inward, the call of the horizon begins to stir. The ocean is not just a boundary, but a gateway, and the new dynasty slowly realizes that to truly secure its place in the world, it must eventually look toward the rising sun and the salt spray of the eastern and western seas. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, you are joining a community of travelers who journey through time while they rest. Here at the Slumber Archives, we share these quiet explorations of the past every single day, weaving history into the fabric of your sleep. If you find peace in these stories, please consider subscribing so you can join us for every new voyage, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary minds find their way to our fireside. It is a pleasure to have you with us as we drift further into the past. In the year 1371, in the rugged province of Yunnan, the boy Ma He is born into a family of high standing. His ancestors were not from these mountains originally. They were of Central Asian descent, officials who had served under the previous Mongol rulers. His father and grandfather were men of faith and travelers in their own right, having made the long, arduous pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. They would sit in the cool mountain evenings, telling stories of distant lands, of golden sands that stretched for miles, and of the great brotherhood of scholars and merchants that linked the world together through trade and prayer. Ma. He listens to these tales with wide eyes, his imagination filling with the colors of foreign markets and the sounds of languages he has yet to hear. But the tranquility of his childhood is fragile. When Ma He is only 10 years old, the armies of the Ming Dynasty arrive in Yunnan to extinguish the last remnants of Mongol influence. The mountains, once a sanctuary of peace, are filled with the clatter of iron and the shouts of soldiers. In the chaos of the conquest, the young boy is captured, taken from his home and his family, and thrust into a life he could never have imagined. He is brought to the Imperial court, a place of gilded towers and silent corridors, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the weight of tradition. Despite the hardship of his early years, Ma He possesses a quiet resilience and a keen, observant mind. He is tall and imposing, even in his youth, with a voice that carries a natural authority. It is here, within the walls of the palace, that he becomes a servant to the Prince of Yan, a man who would later become the Yongle Emperor. The two develop a bond that is forged in the fires of political intrigue and military campaigns. As the years pass, Ma He proves himself to be more than just a servant. He is a strategist, a diplomat, and a man of immense capability. He learns the intricate dances of courtly life, the nuances of governance, and the vital importance of the empire's connection to the outside world. The Ming Dynasty is beginning to stretch its limbs, feeling the strength of its own prosperity. The Yongle Emperor, a man of grand visions and restless ambition, looks out from his throne and sees a world that is waiting to be explored. He desires to demonstrate the magnificence of China to every corner of the earth, not through conquest alone, but through the display of overwhelming splendor and cultural sophistication. He envisions a fleet of ships so vast they would look like floating cities, carrying the treasures of the Middle Kingdom to distant shores and bringing back the wonders of the world to the imperial court. And so, the boy from the mountains of Yunnan, who once knew only the scent of pine and the sight of rocky peaks, is given a new name, Zheng He. He is appointed as the Admiral of the Western Seas, entrusted with the greatest maritime undertaking the world has ever seen. The transition from the dry, thin air of the highlands to the salt-heavy breezes of the coast is a slow and profound transformation. Zheng He stands upon the wooden decks of the shipyards in Nanjing, watching as thousands of craftsmen carve massive hulls from teak and cedar. The sound of hammers and saws becomes the new rhythm of his life, a steady, hypnotic pulse that signals the birth of a new era. The ships currently under construction are marvels of engineering, far larger than anything seen in Europe at the time. These are the treasure ships, some reaching lengths of over 400 feet, with 9 masts and 12 silken sails that catch the wind like the wings of a great bird. They are designed with internal bulkheads, a revolutionary feature that makes them nearly unsinkable, allowing them to weather the fiercest storms of the Indian Ocean. As Zheng He walks through the skeletons of these vessels, he can smell the rich, earthy scent of the tung oil used to seal the wood and the sharp tang of the iron being forged for the massive anchors. The atmosphere in the port cities is electric with anticipation. Merchants, scholars, doctors, and soldiers are all being gathered for the journey. They carry with them the finest products of the Ming Dynasty, delicate porcelain that glows like moonlight, intricate silks that feel like water against the skin, and jars of precious tea leaves harvested from the misty hillsides. There are also chests of gold and silver, intended as gifts for the rulers of foreign lands, a gesture of the emperor's benevolence and wealth. The fleet is not merely a military force, it is a floating embassy, a testament to the belief that the Middle Kingdom is the center of a harmonious and interconnected world. As the final preparations are made, the great rivers of China seem to flow with a new purpose, carrying supplies and people toward the coast. The horizon, once a distant and abstract concept, now feels like a threshold waiting to be crossed. Zheng He looks out over the water as the sun dips low, casting long golden shadows across the waves. He thinks of his father's stories of pilgrimage and the vastness of the world beyond the mountains. He understands that he is carrying the spirit of the Middle Kingdom with him, a legacy of thousands of years of history, now venturing out into the unknown blue. The quiet strength of the Ming Dynasty is about to be tested by the currents of the sea. The boy who was once Ma. He has become the Admiral who will lead 28,000 men across the oceans, guided by the stars and the steady hand of fate. The air is still, the water is calm, and the great fleet sits in the harbour like a sleeping giant, waiting for the first breath of the monsoon wind to carry it toward the edge of the world. In this moment of stillness, before the sails are unfurled and the anchors are raised, there is only the sound of the tide lapping against the wood, a soft rhythmic reminder that the journey is about to begin. The story of the great Admiral does not begin with the salt spray of the sea or the creaking of massive timbers, but rather with the scent of mountain pine and the dry, high-altitude air of Yunnan. Long before he was the Admiral of the Western Seas, he was simply a boy named He, born into a family of modest prestige in the shadow of the Himalayas. His ancestors had travelled thousands of miles from Central Asia to serve the Mongol emperors of the Yuan dynasty, and for generations they had lived as Muslims in this rugged, beautiful frontier. The young Maha likely spent his earliest years listening to his father and grandfather recount their own long pilgrimages to the distant sands of Mecca, planting the first seeds of wanderlust in a mind that would one day map the very edges of the known world. But the world of his childhood was a fragile thing, a flickering candle in the wind of a changing era. The Mongol power that had once stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean was fracturing, and in the year 1381 the rising Ming Dynasty sent its armies to reclaim the final strongholds of the old regime. As the Ming soldiers swept through the valleys of Yunnan, the quiet life of the Ma family was shattered in an instant. Amidst the chaos of the conquest, the 10-year-old boy was captured, ripped away from the mountains of his birth, and taken into the service of the Imperial military. It is a somber thought to imagine a child so young being marched across the vastness of China as a prisoner of war. The journey was long, and the destination was the court of the Prince of Yan, a man named Judi. It was here, in the northern stronghold of Beiping, that the boy's life would undergo its first profound transformation. He was made a eunuch, a common practice for young captives of high potential, ensuring their absolute loyalty to the imperial house. In the quiet, shadowed corridors of the prince's palace, the boy who had lost everything began to rebuild himself. He was no longer a child of the mountains, but a servant of the court, a student of the world who watched, listened, and learned the intricate dance of power. As the years passed, the prince's household became a school of the highest order. He was not merely a servant, he was an observer of the finest details of governance, military strategy, and classical philosophy. He grew tall and imposing, possessed of a voice that was said to be as clear and resonant as a temple bell. The Prince of Yan, a fierce and ambitious leader, saw something remarkable in the young man. A steady gaze and a calm, analytical mind that remained unshaken even in the most turbulent circumstances. A bond of deep trust began to form between them, forged in the cold winters of the north and refined through the shared dangers of border skirmishes. The transition from a captive boy to a trusted advisor was a slow, deliberate process, much like the carving of jade. He studied the ancient texts, learning the wisdom of Confucius and the strategic brilliance of Sun Tzu, while simultaneously maintaining the faith of his ancestors. This dual identity, a scholar of the East and a son of the West, gave him a unique perspective on the world. He understood that the horizon was not a wall, but a doorway. He watched the way the wind moved across the northern plains, and perhaps, in his dreams, he began to imagine how that same wind might feel if it were caught in the silk of a sail. In the year 1399, the peace of the realm was broken by a brutal civil war known as the Jingnan Campaign. The Prince of Yan rose up against his nephew, the young emperor, in a desperate bid for the throne. Throughout this bloody conflict, He was at the prince's side, proving himself not just as a courtier, but as a brilliant military commander. It was during the defense of the city of Beiping that he displayed a level of bravery and tactical genius that cemented his place in history. He moved through the chaos of battle with a measured grace, his presence alone enough to steady the nerves of the soldiers under his command. When the smoke finally cleared, and the Prince of Yan ascended the throne as the Yongle Emperor, he did not forget the man who had stood by him in the darkness. On the first day of the Chinese New Year, in 1404, the emperor bestowed upon He a new name, a name that would echo through the centuries. He was to be known as Zheng He. This change of name was more than just a royal favor. It was a rebirth. The Zheng was taken from the name of the battlefield where he had shown his greatest valor, forever linking his identity to his service to the empire. Now, as the highest-ranking eunuch official in the imperial court, Zheng He found himself at the center of a new world. The Yongle emperor was a man of grand visions, a ruler who wished to project the glory and power of the Ming Dynasty to every corner of the earth. He wanted the world to know that the Middle Kingdom had returned to its former greatness, and he needed someone with the strength, the intellect, and the worldly perspective to lead a mission unlike any the world had ever seen. In the quiet hours of the night within the Forbidden City, the plans began to take shape. The emperor and his trusted official spoke of distant lands described in old scrolls, of the spice markets of India, the ivory coasts of Africa, and the pearl divers of the Persian Gulf. They envisioned a fleet of ships so large they would look like floating cities, capable of carrying thousands of men and enough treasure to buy entire kingdoms. It was a project of staggering ambition, requiring the labor of hundreds of thousands of shipwrights, carpenters, and weavers. As the construction began in the shipyards of Nanjing, Zheng He oversaw every detail with the same calm precision he had shown on the battlefield. He watched as the massive hulls were laid down, the sweet scent of camphor and cedar filling the air. He studied the charts of the stars, learning the positions of the North Star and the Southern Cross, knowing that these distant lights would be his only guides when the land finally dipped below the horizon. The transformation was complete. The boy from the mountains had become the architect of a maritime empire, a man who stood at the intersection of history and legend, preparing to lead his people into the great unknown. The atmosphere in the shipyards was one of hushed, rhythmic industry. The sound of hammers hitting wood echoed across the Yangtze River like a slow, steady heartbeat. Zheng He would often walk among the skeletons of the great ships, his long robes brushing against the sawdust, his mind already miles away at sea. He understood that these vessels were more than just wood and iron. They were the physical embodiment of the emperor's will and the vessels of his own destiny. He was no longer a prisoner of fate, but its master, ready to command the tides themselves. As the first of the great treasure ships was launched, sliding into the water with a thunderous splash that sent ripples across the river, the transition from the court to the coast was finalized. The Admiral stood on the deck, feeling the gentle sway of the vessel for the first time, a movement so different from the steady earth of the palace. It was a rhythmic, soothing motion, a promise of the vast journeys to come. The mountains of Yunnan were a lifetime away, a fading memory of a different world. Ahead lay the endless blue, the whispering winds of the monsoon, and the silent, waiting mysteries of the western seas. The scent of fresh cedar and sandalwood hung heavy in the humid air of Nanjing, a fragrance that seemed to drift from the very heart of the imperial workshops out toward the Yangtze River. This was the scent of a new era, one defined by the ambition of a man who sat upon the dragon throne not by birthright, but by the sharp edge of a sword. Zhu Di, now known to the world as the Yongle Emperor, understood that power obtained through conflict required a special kind of stillness to maintain. He was a ruler of immense energy, a man who sought to cast a shadow so long it would touch the furthest corners of the known world, and in doing so, quiet the whispers that questioned his legitimacy. His reign was to be one of perpetual light, a golden age that would make the people forget the chaos of his ascension and remember only the majesty of the Ming. To look upon the Yongle Emperor was to see a man who believed the mandate of heaven was a physical thing, something that could be built, carved and sailed across the horizon. He was not content with the borders of the Middle Kingdom as they were. He looked toward the sea, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. There is a certain weight to a crown that is seized rather than inherited, a quiet pressure that demands greatness as a form of justification. And so the emperor turned his gaze toward the tides, envisioning a fleet that would serve as a floating extension of his own palace. He desired a world where every king and chieftain, from the spice-rich islands of the south to the distant shores of Africa, would know the name of the Son of Heaven. This was not a vision of conquest in the traditional sense, but a grand rhythmic dance of soft power, a desire to weave the entire world into a tapestry of tribute and respect. The decree he issued was as vast as the ocean itself. He commanded the construction of a fleet, the likes of which the world had never seen, and perhaps will never see again. Thousands of shipwrights, carpenters, and sailmakers were summoned to the shipyards of Nanjing, their hammers creating a steady, rhythmic pulse that echoed through the river valley for years. They were to build the treasure ships, the baochuan, vessels of such immense proportions that they seemed more like floating islands than mere boats. Imagine a ship nearly 400 feet long, with 9 tall masts that caught the wind like the wings of a great bird. The hulls were made of layers of sturdy teak and pine, divided into watertight compartments, a technological marvel centuries ahead of its time, ensuring that even if the sea should bite, the ship would remain buoyant and serene upon the waves. As the years passed and the skeletons of these giants rose toward the sky, the philosophy behind them became clear. The Yongle emperor sought to establish the tribute system as the heartbeat of international relations. In his mind, China was the center of a harmonious universe, and it was his duty to bring the peripheral nations into this circle of peace. This was the essence of the Middle Kingdom's worldview, a belief that true power did not come from the destruction of one's neighbors, but from their willing participation in a grand celestial order. By sending out a fleet of such overwhelming size and beauty, he was offering a choice. To see the treasure fleet was to witness the pinnacle of human achievement, a display of wealth and sophistication that made resistance feel unnecessary, even foolish. It was an invitation to join a world of trade, culture, and mutual recognition, all under the benevolent gaze of the Ming. The emperor's vision was deeply rooted in the Confucian ideals of hierarchy and social harmony. He believed that if he acted as a virtuous and powerful elder brother to the smaller nations, they would naturally respond with loyalty and gifts. This was the soft power of the 15th century, a sophisticated diplomacy that used awe as its primary currency. The ships were to be filled not with armies of occupation, but with treasures that spoke of China's elegance, delicate blue and white porcelain that felt like silk to the touch, rolls of shimmering brocade in colors that mimicked the sunset, and intricate carvings of jade that seemed to hold a life of their own. These were the messengers of the emperor's intent, a way to say that his reach was infinite, yet his touch was refined. Meanwhile, the logistics of such an undertaking were staggering, requiring a level of organization that felt almost supernatural. The emperor funneled the wealth of an entire empire into the shipyards, transforming the landscape of the coast. Forests were felled to provide the timber, and the ironworks of the north burned night and day to forge the anchors and fittings. It was a time of immense movement, a slow, deliberate gathering of resources that felt like the tide coming in. Thousands of sailors were recruited and trained, men who would have to learn the language of the stars and the secrets of the monsoon winds. They were preparing to leave the familiar shores of their ancestors for a world that existed only in maps and travelers' tales, a world where the water turned a different shade of blue and the stars shifted their positions in the night sky. The Yongle emperor often spent his evenings looking over the plans for the voyages, his mind wandering far beyond the walls of the forbidden city. He saw the fleet as a mirror, reflecting his own glory back to him from across the waves. Every exotic animal brought back to his court, every new spice that flavored his banquets, and every foreign envoy who bowed before his throne was a confirmation of his right to rule. He was building a legacy that would be written in the salt and the spray, a story of a kingdom that did not need to hide behind walls, but could stride confidently across the deep. There is a quiet, meditative quality to such ambition, a sense of looking so far into the future that the present moment begins to feel like a dream. And as the first of the great ships were finally guided into the water, their massive hulls displacing the river with a deep, resonating groan, the transition from vision to reality was complete. The Admiral, Zheng He, watched as the red lacquered wood met the grey-green water of the Yangtze. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of the Emperor's expectations. He was the hand that would carry this vision across the world, the voice that would speak for the Son of Heaven in lands where the language was strange and the customs were unknown. The ships were ready, their holds waiting to be filled with the wonders of the earth, and their sails folded like the petals of a flower, waiting for the morning sun. The air in the shipyards began to change as the final preparations were made. The frantic energy of construction gave way to a focused, quiet intensity. The smell of sawdust was replaced by the briny tang of the estuary, a reminder that the river was merely a path to the open sea. The Yongle Emperor's vision was no longer a matter of ink on parchment or whispered commands in the palace. It was a physical force, a fleet of hundreds of vessels swaying in unison with the movement of the tide. This was the beginning of a journey that would redefine the boundaries of the known world, a journey fueled by the desire for legitimacy and the belief that harmony could be found in the vast, whispering stretches of the western seas. The world was waiting, silent and unsuspecting, for the arrival of the treasure fleet, and the man who commanded it felt the pull of the horizon like a physical tug upon his soul. To understand the sheer magnitude of the ambition held by the Yongle Emperor, one must look not to the open ocean, but to the muddy banks of the Yangtze River, just outside the stone walls of Nanjing. Here, the air was thick with the scent of freshly sawn cedar and the rhythmic, percussive song of 10,000 mallets striking wood. This was the Longjiang shipyard, a place where the earth itself seemed to be transforming into a fleet. Imagine a landscape carved into a series of massive parallel basins stretching as far as the eye can see along the river's edge. These were the dry docks of the Ming Dynasty, engineering marvels that allowed the river water to be ushered in and then drained away, leaving behind a cradle of silt and timber where giants could be born. It is said that over 30,000 craftsmen, labourers, and specialists lived and worked within this sprawling industrial city. There were blacksmiths forging anchors that weighed as much as a small house, rope makers twisting thick fibres of hemp into cables that could withstand the fury of a typhoon, and sail makers stitching together vast expanses of reinforced silk and bamboo matting. The scale of the labour force was such that the shipyard functioned as its own ecosystem, a world of sawdust and sweat, where the singular purpose was to give physical form to the Emperor's dreams of grandeur. As you drift deeper into this scene, your attention might be drawn to the skeletal frames of the vessels themselves, rising from the docks like the rib cages of great wooden whales. These were the Baochuan, the legendary treasure ships, and their dimensions were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. While the ships of Europe at this time were modest caravels, often no longer than 70 or 80 feet, the chronicles of the Ming tell us that Zheng He's flagship reached a staggering length of 447 feet, with a breadth of 180 feet. Even if one allows for the poetic exaggerations of court historians, the archaeological evidence of massive rudder posts found in the Nanjing mud suggests a scale of shipbuilding that defies easy comprehension. These were floating cities designed not just for transport, but for the projection of absolute power. They possessed 9 masts, staggered in such a way that they could catch the wind from almost any direction, and their sails were not simple sheets of canvas, but complex, ribbed structures that could be adjusted with the precision of a fan. The sight of such a vessel on the horizon, its red sails unfurling like the wings of a phoenix, must have felt like an apparition from another realm. The ingenuity of the Longjiang shipbuilders went far beneath the surface of the water, incorporating technical innovations that would not be seen in the West for centuries. Perhaps the most significant of these was the development of watertight compartments. The hull of a treasure ship was divided into a series of independent sealed chambers. This meant that if the ship were to strike a reef or be damaged in a storm, the water would be confined to a single section, allowing the vessel to remain buoyant while repairs were made. It was a philosophy of resilience, a recognition that the sea is unpredictable and that a ship must be able to survive its own wounds. These compartments also served a secondary, more peaceful purpose, acting as massive vats where fresh water could be stored or where exotic fish could be kept alive during the long voyage home. The construction of these ships was a slow, deliberate process, a meditation in joinery and resin. Workers used a mixture of lime and tung oil, known as chunam, to seal every seam, creating a bond that was both flexible and impervious to the salt of the Indian Ocean. The wood itself was carefully selected, teak for the outer hull to resist the boring of shipworms, and sturdy pine for the interior structures. As the ships grew taller, they were outfitted with multiple decks that could house hundreds of sailors, soldiers, and diplomats. There were even areas dedicated to the cultivation of fresh vegetables in tubs of soil, ensuring that the crew remained healthy during months at sea. Walking through the shipyard in those years, one would have felt a sense of quiet, focused intensity. The Ming engineers were blending traditional wisdom with a new, experimental spirit. They understood the physics of the balanced rudder, which allowed a single man to steer a vessel of immense weight with relative ease. They understood the importance of the center of gravity, weighted with ballast of lead and stone to ensure that these towering structures would not capsize in the rolling swells of the deep ocean. Everything was calculated, from the tension in the rigging to the thickness of the hull planks, creating a harmony between the weight of the wood and the lift of the water. As the sun set over the Yangtze, casting long shadows across the dry docks, the shipyard would not fall entirely silent. The glowing embers of the forges remained, and the low murmur of the night watchman echoed through the timber frames. There was a profound sense of anticipation in the air, a realization that these ships were more than just wood and iron. They were vessels of culture, carrying the language, the art, and the philosophy of the Middle Kingdom into the unknown. The treasure ships were designed to be self-sufficient worlds. On the upper decks, cabins were constructed for high-ranking officials, decorated with fine silks and lacquerware, providing a touch of the imperial court amidst the spray of the sea. Below, the hold was partitioned to carry the vast quantities of goods that would be used for trade and tribute. Porcelain of the finest blue and white, rolls of shimmering silk, and jars of medicinal herbs. But there was also space for the curiosities that the fleet hoped to bring back. Empty chambers waiting to be filled with the scents of spices, the glitter of gems, and the sight of animals never before seen by Chinese eyes. The relationship between the ship and the sailor in this era was one of deep respect. The sailors viewed their vessels as living entities, often painting large, watchful eyes on the bow so that the ship might see its way through the fog and over the treacherous waves. At Longjiang, as each ship reached completion, ceremonies were held to appease the spirits of the water and to bless the journey ahead. Incense would drift through the masts, and the sound of gongs would vibrate through the hull, a final resonance before the dry docks were opened, and the river was allowed to rush back in, lifting the Leviathan for the first time. And so, the landscape of Nanjing was forever altered by this feverish era of creation. The forests of the surrounding provinces were thinned to provide the timber, and the wealth of the empire was poured into the docks, but the result was a fleet that stood as the pinnacle of maritime technology. When Zheng He walked among these rising giants, he was not just inspecting a military force, he was witnessing the birth of a bridge made of wood and wind that would soon span the distance between the familiar shores of China and the mysterious, palm-fringed coasts of the distant west. The ships were ready, their hulls seasoned and their masts reaching for the clouds, waiting for the command to leave the safety of the river and begin their long, slow dance with the tides of history. To understand the true scale of this undertaking, one must look past the towering masts and the gilded sterns of the treasure ships and peer instead into the intricate, pulsing heart of the fleet's organization. It is one thing to build a ship, but it is quite another to sustain a floating city for years at a time upon the trackless blue of the Indian Ocean. Zheng He did not merely lead a group of sailors, he commanded a society in miniature, a carefully calibrated hierarchy of 27,000 souls, each with a specific purpose, each a vital thread in the immense tapestry of the Ming Dynasty's ambition. Imagine the bustle on the docks as the final rosters are called. There are the seasoned mariners, men who have spent their lives reading the language of the waves and the subtle shifts in the monsoon winds. Beside them stand thousands of soldiers, their armor polished and their banners furled, ready to protect the emperor's prestige in foreign ports. But the fleet's true character is found in the specialists, the men of letters and science, who move quietly among the crates and coils of rope. There are linguists and translators, capable of speaking the tongues of the Persian Gulf and the Swahili coast, waiting to bridge the gap between empires. There are astronomers who will spend their nights on the high decks, charting the stars of the southern hemisphere to refine the fleet's position. And perhaps most importantly, there are the physicians and herbalists, the keepers of health who carry with them the ancient wisdom of Chinese medicine, ensuring that the crew remains resilient against the strange fevers and ailments of distant lands. The logistics of feeding and hydrating 27,000 people in the 15th century was a feat of engineering that bordered on the miraculous. In an era when European voyages often struggled with scurvy and starvation, within weeks of losing sight of land, the treasure fleet moved with the calculated grace of a well-supplied army. This was made possible by a specialized support system, a train of auxiliary vessels that functioned as the fleet's lifeblood. Among the great warships and merchant vessels sailed the grain ships, their cavernous holds filled to the brim with thousands of tons of rice, millet, and flour. These were the granaries of the sea, ensuring that even in the middle of a vast salt wilderness, the scent of steaming rice would drift through the corridors of the fleet every morning and evening. Even more remarkable were the water ships. Fresh water has always been the most precious commodity at sea, the one thing that can bring even the greatest expedition to its knees. Zheng He's fleet addressed this with characteristic ingenuity, employing massive tankers designed specifically to carry fresh water in enormous, internally baffled tanks that prevented the liquid from sloshing and destabilizing the ship. These vessels allowed the fleet to bypass arid coastlines and sail for weeks without the desperate need to find a spring or a river, and yet the Ming planners went even further. They understood that a diet of dry grain and stale water was a recipe for illness. On the decks of many ships, large wooden tubs were filled with rich earth, creating floating gardens where fresh vegetables and soybean sprouts were grown in the open air. The crew would harvest these greens daily, providing the vital nutrients that kept the dreaded scurvy at bay, a practice that was centuries ahead of its time. As the fleet moved across the water, it maintained a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The herbalists were not merely there to treat the sick, they were active participants in the fleet's economy of health. They carried vast stores of dried ginger, cinnamon, and medicinal teas, and at every port of call, They would venture inland to seek out new plants, expanding the botanical knowledge of the Middle Kingdom. They maintained a meticulous inventory of their stores, knowing that a single outbreak of disease could spread through the crowded decks like wildfire. But under Zheng He's watchful eye, the fleet remained remarkably healthy, a testament to the cleanliness and order that was enforced from the highest admiral down to the lowest deckhand. The coordination required to keep these hundreds of ships in formation, to ensure that the water ships were accessible to the treasure ships, and that the grain ships were protected by the warships, required a sophisticated system of signaling. During the day, colorful flags fluttered from the riggings, conveying complex commands across miles of open water. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the world turned to a deep, velvety indigo, the fleet did not disappear into the darkness. Instead, they used lanterns, hundreds of glowing lanterns that bobbed upon the waves like a constellation of fallen stars. In the event of fog or heavy rain, the silence of the ocean was broken by the rhythmic beat of drums and the haunting, resonant chime of gongs, a sonic tether that kept the floating city together when the eyes could no longer see. There is a profound peace in considering the sheer order of it all, the way 27,000 lives were synchronized with the rising and setting of the sun. In the quiet hours of the night, while the majority of the crew slept in their narrow bunks, the watchmen would pace the decks, their footsteps a soft percussion against the weathered wood. They would look out over the dark expanse of the sea, knowing that just a few hundred yards away, another ship was doing the same, and another beyond that, stretching out until the fleet occupied the entire horizon. They were a world unto themselves, a self-sustaining ecosystem of wood, silk, and humanity, carrying the culture and the comforts of home into the great unknown. As the fleet progressed, the logistics became a form of diplomacy in itself. To arrive at a foreign port with 27,000 well-fed, healthy, and disciplined men was a display of power far more effective than any show of weapons. It spoke of a civilization that had mastered the elements, a society so wealthy and so organized that it could project its entire way of life across the globe without strain. The supply chain was the invisible foundation upon which the glory of the Ming was built. Every bag of rice, every jar of fresh water, and every bundle of medicinal herbs was a brick in that foundation, allowing Zheng He to focus his mind not on survival, but on the grander purpose of his mission. The Admiral himself often walked among the men, his presence a calm and steadying influence. He knew the weight of the responsibility he carried. The lives of these thousands of souls rested upon the accuracy of his charts and the integrity of his supply lines. He understood that the fleet was only as strong as its weakest link, and so he obsessed over the details that others might overlook. He inspected the seals on the water tanks. He tasted the quality of the grain. He spoke with the physicians about the health of the rowers. In these moments, he was not just an admiral or a diplomat. He was the caretaker of a vast, wandering family, guiding them through the shifting currents of the world with a steady hand and a quiet, unwavering resolve. And so, as the fleet moved further away from the familiar landmarks of the Chinese coast, the logistics of the floating city became a source of comfort. The familiar smells of the kitchen fires, the orderly ringing of the bells to mark the passage of time, and the sight of the sturdy grain ships nearby provided a sense of stability in an ever-changing landscape. They were no longer just sailors on a voyage. They were the inhabitants of a new kind of territory, one that existed between the lands they had left and the lands they were yet to discover. The ocean was no longer a barrier, but a highway, and their ships were the vehicles of a destiny that was being written with every league they crossed, supported by the silent, tireless machinery of a supply chain that reached back across the waves to the heart of the Ming Empire itself. The year was 1405, and the air in Suzhou was thick with the scent of cedar oil and the rhythmic thrum of drums. Along the banks of the Liuhe River, the water seemed to vanish beneath a canopy of red and gold silk. It is said that when the fleet finally cast off, the sheer volume of the vessels caused the tide itself to hesitate, a forest of masts swaying in unison as they moved toward the open mouth of the sea. Imagine standing upon the shoreline as these 300 ships began their slow, deliberate dance into the blue. At the center sat the treasure ships, those 9-masted leviathans that rose out of the water like floating palaces, their hulls painted with the eyes of dragons to help them see through the murky depths. Around them swarmed the smaller water tankers, the troop transports, and the swift patrol boats, all moving with a coordinated grace that spoke of years of preparation. As they cleared the coast of China, the horizon simply disappeared, replaced by a wall of white sails that stretched as far as the eye could see, a city of wood and rope, drifting away from the known world and into the vast, shimmering embrace of the South China Sea. The transition from the river to the deep ocean brought a new kind of silence. Gone was the chatter of the docks and the heavy smell of the earth, replaced by the sharp, clean salt spray and the constant rhythmic creaking of timber. For the sailors and soldiers aboard, life became measured by the watch and the stars. Zheng He, standing upon the high stern of his flagship, would have looked out over a world that felt infinite, yet he possessed the tools to tame it. In the quiet of the night, the navigators gathered on the upper decks, their eyes fixed on the heavens. They used the star charts, intricate maps of the sky that allowed them to calculate their position by the height of the North Star above the horizon. Using a series of small ebony boards held at arm's length, they measured the distance between the sea and the stars, a celestial geometry that whispered their location across the trackless waves. Beside them sat the water compass, a delicate needle of magnetized iron floating in a bowl of water, its tip always trembling toward the south. It was a rhythmic, meditative process. The steady checking of the needle, the quiet consultation of the charts, and the soft splashing of the lead line as it was tossed overboard to feel for the hidden contour of the seabed. As they moved further south, the air grew heavy and sweet with the humidity of the tropics. The first destination on this grand itinerary was the Kingdom of Champa, located along the central coast of what we now know as Vietnam. As the fleet approached the port of Vijaya, the local inhabitants must have looked out in utter disbelief. One can only imagine the sight of dozens of ships, each larger than any temple or palace on land, appearing like a mirage out of the morning mist. Zheng He did not arrive as a conqueror, but as a herald of the Ming Emperor's majesty. The encounters were marked by a grand, slow-moving diplomacy. There were processions of silk-clad officials, the exchange of heavy gold coins for fragrant sandalwood and ivory, and long, lingering banquets where the flavors of the south met the refined palates of the north. The atmosphere was one of mutual curiosity, a quiet recognition of the vastness of the world and the many ways in which people found to live within it. The fleet stayed for weeks, their presence a constant shimmering backdrop to the daily life of the port, before the monsoon winds signaled it was time to move once more. The journey continued southward, deeper into the heart of the Indonesian archipelago, toward the powerful Majapahit Empire on the island of Java. Here, the landscape changed again. The sea became a labyrinth of emerald islands and hidden reefs, requiring the utmost focus from the pilots. The water here was a different shade of blue, clearer, warmer, and teeming with life that darted beneath the hulls of the great ships like flashes of silver light. Upon reaching the northern coast of Java, the fleet encountered a land of immense wealth and complex politics. The Majapahit Empire was a sophisticated maritime power in its own right, and the arrival of the Chinese fleet was a moment of profound significance. Zheng He navigated these waters with a careful hand, balancing the display of Ming power with the delicate requirements of trade. In the markets of Java, the sailors traded fine porcelain and delicate silks for spices that smelled of earth and fire, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper that would eventually find their way back to the kitchens of the Forbidden City. There is a certain peace in imagining these long days at sea, where the primary occupation was the observation of the wind and the water. The fleet moved as a single organism, a giant clockwork mechanism of wood and hemp. Evenings were likely spent in quiet contemplation, the crews gathering on deck to watch the sun dip below the waves, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered gold. They were thousands of miles from home, yet they carried their home with them in the familiar taste of their rations, the sound of their own language, and the steady, reassuring presence of the Admiral's flagship leading the way. In these early months of the first voyage, the mission was as much about discovery as it was about diplomacy. Every island sighted was a new entry in the logs. Every new current felt by the rudder was a lesson learned for the future. The navigators noted the patterns of the birds, the color of the water, and the way the clouds gathered over distant land masses. They were mapping not just the geography of the earth, but the possibilities of human reach. As the fleet prepared to leave the shores of Java and head toward the Malacca Strait, they were entering a bottleneck of history, a narrow passage where the trade of the entire world seemed to converge. The air was thick with the anticipation of what lay ahead, the legendary spice ports, the vast Indian Ocean, and the distant, fabled coasts of India. But for now, as the sails caught the steady breeze and the ships turned their bows toward the northwest, there was only the sound of the hull slicing through the water and the endless, soothing rhythm of the sea, carrying them further into the unknown, one gentle wave at a time. The scent of the sea changes as the fleet enters the narrow corridors of the Malacca Strait, turning from the sharp, open salt of the South China Sea to a heavy, humid sweetness, a thick aroma of damp earth, tropical rot, and the heady, invisible trails of cinnamon and clove drifting from the shorelines. This narrow neck of water is the throat of the world's commerce, a bottleneck where every vessel must pass, and where the shadows of the coastline seem to lean in, watching the massive treasure ships with 1,000 hidden eyes. For years, a different kind of power has reigned here, one that does not answer to the Ming Emperor or any earthly king. This is the domain of the shadows, the realm of the pirate king Chen Zuyi, a man whose name is whispered with a mixture of terror and grudging respect by every merchant from Java to the Bay of Bengal. Chen Zuyi is no mere common thief. He is a fallen general from the mainland who fled the chaos of the early Ming years to carve out his own empire in the city of Palembang on the island of Sumatra. From his driftwood throne, he commands a fleet of over 90 ships and thousands of hardened men, preying upon the very trade routes that Zheng He has been sent to protect. To the Admiral, this is not merely a nuisance. It is a direct challenge to the harmony of the seas. As the treasure fleet anchors near the mouth of the Musi River, the air is unnervingly still, the water reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun like a sheet of burnished copper, while beneath the surface the current pulls toward the dark, tangled mangroves where the pirates lie in wait. Zheng He, ever the diplomat, initially seeks a peaceful resolution, offering the pirate king a chance to submit and return to the emperor's grace. Chen Zuyi feigns a humble surrender, sending messengers with promises of tribute and loyalty, but his words are as hollow as a rotted hull. He plans a night attack, a desperate gamble to capture the legendary treasure ships and claim their riches for himself. But the Admiral is a student of the old masters, a man who understands the geometry of war as well as he understands the stars. He has already positioned his smaller, more agile scout ships in the shadows, their crews silent, their weapons ready, waiting for the first ripple of an oar in the dark. The battle, when it begins, is not a chaotic brawl, but a display of terrifying, calculated precision. As Chen Zuyi's fleet emerges from the river mouth under the cover of a moonless sky, they find not a sleeping giant, but a wall of fire and wood. The treasure ships, despite their immense size, move with a haunting grace, pivoting in the current to bring their heavy bronze cannons to bear. The sound of the first broadside shatters the silence of the night, a rolling thunder that echoes off the jungle canopy for miles, sending clouds of white smoke drifting over the water like ghosts. The pirates, accustomed to terrorizing defenseless merchant dhows, find themselves staring up at the towering red hulls of ships that seem more like floating fortresses than vessels of trade. In the flickering light of burning pitch and flaming arrows, the tactical brilliance of the treasure fleet becomes clear. Zheng He does not simply engage the enemy, he orchestrates the movement of his ships like a conductor. The larger vessels provide a stable platform for the archers and the fire-throwers, while the swifter, medium-sized ships dart through the smoke to cut off any hope of retreat. The water of the Palembang harbour churns with the debris of broken masts and shattered oars. It is the first major naval engagement for the fleet, a baptism of fire that proves these ships were built for more than just carrying silk and porcelain. They were built to enforce a new era of order upon the waves. As the dawn begins to break, casting a pale grey light over the wreckage-strewn bay, the pirate fleet is no more. Over 5,000 of Chen Zuyi's men have perished, and his flagship lies broken against the shore. The pirate king himself is taken alive, bound in heavy chains to be brought back to Nanjing for the emperor's judgment. The victory is absolute, and its ripples are felt instantly across the Indian Ocean. The news travels faster than the wind. The message is clear to every king, every sultan, and every corsair from the coast of Africa to the islands of the east. The Admiral of the Western Seas has arrived, and the old ways of lawlessness are over. The clearing of the Palembang pirates does more than just secure a single port. It flings wide the gates of the Malacca Strait, transforming a dangerous bottleneck into a secure highway of human interaction. The trade routes, once choked by fear, begin to breathe again. Ships that once huddled in groups for protection now sail with a new sense of freedom, their holds filled with the treasures of a dozen different lands. There is a profound sense of relief in the way the sailors now go about their work, their movements slower and more rhythmic, as the constant tension of watching the horizon for black sails begins to fade into a memory. The fleet lingers in the region for a time, ensuring that the new administration in Palembang is stable and that the local leaders understand the benefits of the Ming peace. Zheng He walks the shores of the island, his tall, imposing figure a symbol of the distant emperor's reach. He watches the local fishermen return to their nets, the rhythmic splash of their weights in the water a soothing counterpoint to the violent echoes of the battle. The jungle, once a place of hidden threats, now seems to offer only its bounty, the scent of sandalwood and the bright, vibrant plumage of tropical birds that flit through the emerald leaves. There is a quiet dignity in this moment of transition. The Admiral knows that his mission is not one of conquest, but of connection. By removing the obstacle of Chen Zuyi, he has woven the Strait of Malacca into the great Ming tapestry, ensuring that the flow of goods and ideas can continue unhindered toward the west. The treasure fleet is no longer just a collection of ships. It is the heartbeat of a new world order, a rhythmic pulse that carries the promise of prosperity to every shore it touches. As the repairs are completed and the supplies are replenished, the men look toward the horizon once more, where the great expanse of the Indian Ocean waits, its deep blue waters promising a journey into the heart of the unknown. The sails are unfurled once more, the massive sheets of red silk catching the steady monsoon winds. The ships groan softly as they pull away from the Sumatran coast, a sound like a long, contented sigh. Behind them, the city of Palembang fades into the mist, its harbour quiet and safe for the first time in a generation. Ahead, the sea is wide and welcoming,
the waves rolling in long, slow swells that rock the great ships with a gentle, hypnotic motion. The transition from the narrow, dangerous straits to the open sea is like waking from a troubled dream into a bright, clear morning where the only limit is the line where the water meets the sky. And so, with the pirate threat extinguished and the trade route secured, the treasure fleet continues its westward march. Every league they travel reinforces the Admiral's vision of a world united by the sea, a world where the vast distances between peoples are bridged by the steady, unceasing movement of the tides. The rhythm of life aboard the ships settles back into its familiar pattern. The creak of the timber, the snapping of the banners in the wind, and the quiet murmurs of the men as they watch the sun dip below the horizon, painting the world in shades of violet and gold. They carry with them the peace of Palembang, a peace bought with fire but maintained, with the steady, measured hand of a man who knows that the true strength of a fleet lies not in its cannons, but in the security of the paths it leaves behind.
The scent of the air changes long before the coastline of India rises to meet the horizon, shifting from the salt crust of the open sea to something heavy, sweet, and profoundly ancient. It is the fragrance of crushed cardamom and drying peppercorns carried on a warm breeze that seems to wrap around the masts of the treasure fleet like a silken ribbon. As the ships draw closer to the Malabar coast, the deep indigo of the Indian Ocean begins to pale into a soft, milky turquoise, and the sailors on the high decks of the dragon ships catch their first glimpse of the legendary city of Calicut. Known to the world as the City of Spices, it is a place where the earth itself seems to breathe out the wealth of the East. A bustling, vibrant gateway where the trade routes of the world converge in a symphony of languages and colours. Zheng He stands at the prow of his flagship, watching as the harbour comes alive with hundreds of smaller vessels, narrow dhows with their triangular lateen sails and sturdy coastal rafts that bob in the wake of the Chinese giants. To the eyes of the Ming sailors, this land is a marvel of contrasts, a place where the lush green backdrop of the Western Ghats Mountains meets a shoreline teeming with humanity from every corner of the known map. The fleet drops its massive iron anchors with a rhythmic splash, and the process of diplomacy begins with the slow, deliberate grace that the Admiral demands. This is not a conquest, but a meeting of two great civilizations, and the air is thick with the anticipation of what is to be exchanged. The ruler of this realm is the Zamarin, a title that carries the weight of centuries of tradition and maritime power. He is a man who understands that his city's prosperity depends on the delicate balance of the monsoon winds and the goodwill of the merchants who ride them. When Zheng He finally steps onto the sun-drenched docks, he is met with a spectacle of royal hospitality that rivals the splendor of the Ming court itself. The Zamarin receives the Chinese delegation in a hall cooled by thick stone walls and shaded by intricately carved awnings, where the floor is covered in vibrant carpets and the air is heavy with the smoke of burning resins. The chronicler, Ma Huan, who walks alongside the Admiral, records these moments with a keen and curious eye, noting the Zamarin's dignified presence. A king who wears fine white muslin and is adorned with strings of pearls and belts of pure gold, yet who moves with a simple, quiet authority. The exchange of gifts is a choreographed dance of mutual respect, a ritual that takes hours to unfold under the watchful eyes of priests and advisers. From the holds of the treasure ships come the finest products of the Middle Kingdom, bolts of heavy silk embroidered with dragons and peonies, and porcelain vases so thin and translucent they seem to catch and hold the afternoon light like frozen water. In return, the Zamarin offers the treasures of the Indian earth. There are piles of black pepper, often called black gold, which is so valuable that it is measured out with the care one might give to diamonds. There are baskets of green cardamom pods, fragrant ginger, and cinnamon bark that has been dried in the sun until it curls into sweet, woody quills. The Chinese officials also marvel at the precious stones brought before them, deep red rubies from the interior, and sapphires that match the color of the deep ocean they have just crossed. As the days turn into weeks, the men of the fleet are permitted to wander the markets and streets of Calicut, and it is through the writings of Ma Huan that we see this world through 15th century eyes. He describes a society that is deeply ordered, yet incredibly diverse, noting the presence of Arab traders, Persian merchants, and local devotees who live side by side in a state of relative harmony. Ma Huan is particularly fascinated by the local customs, writing with a gentle curiosity about the way the people of Calicut eat with their fingers from large green leaves, and how they refuse to eat the meat of the cow, treating the animal with a reverence that the Chinese sailors find both strange and admirable. He observes the intricate caste system and the way the people dress in light, airy fabrics to combat the tropical heat, a sharp contrast to the heavy, layered robes of the Ming bureaucracy. The markets of Calicut are a sensory overload for the visitors, a labyrinth of stalls where the sound of bartering in a dozen tongues creates a constant low hum like a hive of bees. There are mountains of dried fish, piles of coconuts, and artisans who work with gold and silver with such precision that the Chinese jewelers among the crew stop to study their techniques. In these moments of quiet observation, the vast distance between Nanjing and the Malabar coast seems to shrink. Despite the differences in faith, language, and diet, there is a shared understanding of the value of honest trade and the importance of the sea as a bridge between worlds. The sailors find that the people of India are shrewd negotiators, but also deeply hospitable, often inviting the travelers to share a meal or a story under the shade of a banyan tree. Night in Calicut brings a different kind of beauty, as the heat of the day dissipates into a cool, salty breeze. From the decks of the treasure ships, the city appears as a constellation of flickering oil lamps and cooking fires, stretching along the curves of the bay. The sounds of drums and flutes drift across the water from distant temples, mixing with the gentle lap of the waves against the wooden hulls. For Zheng He, these nights are a time of reflection and administrative labor. He sits in his cabin, the light of a single tallow candle illuminating the maps and logs spread before him. He must ensure that every ounce of pepper is accounted for, that every diplomatic slight is smoothed over, and that the morale of his thousands of men remains steady as they prepare for the next leg of their journey. The Admiral knows that Calicut is more than just a place to gather spices. It is the pivot point of his entire mission. It is here that the fleet truly leaves the familiar waters of the East and prepares to strike out across the Arabian Sea toward the distant shores of Africa and the Middle East. The success of the mission depends on the friendships forged here, in the shadow of the spice warehouses and the royal palace. Ma Huan notes that the people of Calicut are sincere and trustworthy, a high praise from a man who has seen the treachery of the pirate dens in the South China Sea. This mutual trust allows for a level of commerce that is unprecedented in scale, a flow of goods that will eventually find its way back to the Forbidden City, scenting the halls of the Emperor with the essence of a land thousands of miles away. As the time for departure nears, the pace of work on the docks intensifies. The treasure ships are heavy now, sitting lower in the water as their holds are packed tight with the wealth of India. The scent of the fleet has changed again, no longer just the smell of cedar and hemp, but a rich, complex aroma of 1,000 different spices, all mingling together in the warm, humid air. The men spend their final hours on land purchasing small trinkets for their families, a bit of jewelry, a strangely shaped seashell, or a small bag of precious incense. They have seen the wonders of the city of spices, and as they row back to their ships for the final time, they carry the memory of the Zamorin's golden courts
and the kindness of the street vendors in their hearts. The departure from Calicut is a grand affair, marked by the sounding of gongs and the blowing of conch shells from the shore. The Zamorin sends his envoys to accompany the fleet, carrying further messages of friendship to the Ming Emperor. As the great sails are unfurled, catching the first breath of the returning monsoon winds, the treasure fleet turns its bows toward the west. The coastline of India begins to fade into a hazy line of green and gold, and the familiar rhythm of the open ocean returns. The creak of the timber and the snapping of the banners are the only sounds in the vast blue silence as the Admiral and his men look toward the horizon, wondering what new marvels await them in the lands where the sun sets.
The scent of sandalwood and drying cloves hangs heavy in the humid air of the southern seas, a fragrant reminder that the world is far larger and more intricate than the maps of the Middle Kingdom once suggested. As the second and third expeditions venture further into the jade-green waters of Southeast Asia, the treasure fleet becomes more than just a collection of ships. It transforms into a floating city of diplomacy, a mobile court that carries the weight and the will of the Yongle Emperor to every shore it touches. The fleet makes its way toward the kingdom of Siam, where the rivers wind like silver serpents through dense emerald jungles. Here, the Admiral moves with a measured grace, navigating the delicate social hierarchies of the region as skillfully as he navigates the coastal shallows. The rulers of Siam receive the Ming envoys with a mixture of awe and pragmatic respect, recognizing that to be a friend of the treasure fleet is to be a friend of the most powerful empire on earth. In the quiet halls of the Siamese court, amidst the flicker of oil lamps and the rhythmic chanting of monks, the tribute system begins to tighten its golden threads. Gifts of fine silk, intricate porcelain, and lacquerware are exchanged for local treasures, but the true currency is recognition. By accepting the Ming calendar and the Emperor's seals, Siam enters into a celestial dance of loyalty and protection, ensuring that the trade routes remain open and the peace of the seas is maintained. Further south, the fleet arrives at the bustling ports of Java, an island where the volcanic soil yields a bounty of spices and the air is thick with the sound of gamelan music drifting from the villages. The political landscape of Java is a complex tapestry of competing interests, yet the presence of the massive treasure ships acts as a grounding force. Zheng He observes the local customs with a patient, watchful eye, understanding that the expansion of the tribute system is not merely about wealth, but about the creation of a harmonious world order centered on the Ming throne. As the Javanese leaders offer their tribute of exotic birds, sulfur, and precious metals, they are woven into the expanding fabric of the Ming sphere of influence, a network that now stretches from the yellow waters of the Yangtze to the tropical heat of the Indonesian archipelago. As the third expedition pushes deeper into the Indian Ocean, the fleet approaches the island of Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka. This is a land of mist-covered mountains and ancient ruins, where the air is said to be scented by the sacred footprints of the Buddha. However, beneath the serene beauty of the island, a storm of political unrest is brewing. The local ruler, King Alakeshvara, is a man of volatile temper and deep suspicion, viewing the arrival of the Chinese fleet not as an opportunity for trade, but as a threat to his own flickering power. When the Admiral seeks to pay respects at the sacred shrines and establish peaceful relations, he finds himself met with hostility and treachery. The king, perhaps emboldened by the distance between his island and the Ming capital, attempts to trap the Chinese delegation, demanding exorbitant payments and even plotting to seize the treasure fleet itself. But Zheng He is a man who has spent his life studying the art of strategy, and he recognizes the signs of a trap long before it is sprung. In a move that would be studied by historians for centuries, the Admiral realizes that the king's forces are concentrated on the coast, leaving the royal capital vulnerable. With a small, disciplined force of 2,000 elite soldiers, Zheng He executes a daring overland march under the cover of the tropical night. The jungle is alive with the sounds of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures, but the Ming soldiers move with the silence of ghosts, their armor muffled and their intent focused. By the time the sun begins to peek over the eastern ridges of Ceylon, the Ming forces have reached the capital. In a swift and decisive action, they breach the city gates and capture King Alakeshvara along with his family and high officials. The resistance crumbles as the king's own subjects, many of whom had grown tired of his erratic rule, watch in stunned silence. There is no grand massacre, no burning of the city. Instead, there is the cold, clean efficiency of a power that knows its own strength. The king is taken back to the ships, not as a fallen warrior, but as a captive of the emperor, destined to be taken across the vast ocean to answer for his defiance in the halls of the Forbidden City. This intervention in the internal politics of Ceylon sends a ripple of shock and realization across the eastern Indian Ocean. It is a clear demonstration that while the Ming come in peace, seeking harmony and trade, they possess the reach and the resolve to enforce their will when the safety of the fleet or the dignity of the emperor is compromised. As the ships sail away from the island, leaving behind a newly appointed and more cooperative ruler, the prestige of the Ming court grows to unprecedented heights. The news travels faster than the ships themselves, carried by merchant dhows and coastal traders. The Admiral of the Western Seas is a man of his word, and his emperor's shadow is long enough to reach even the most distant palace. The journey back toward the mainland is one of quiet reflection. On the decks of the treasure ships, the soldiers and sailors talk in hushed tones about the mountains of Ceylon and the strange, fierce king who thought he could outmaneuver the admiral. The prestige of the Ming court is no longer just a theoretical concept discussed by scholars in Nanjing. It is a tangible reality, felt in the way the port authorities in Malacca bow a little lower, and in the way the merchant vessels of the Indian coast clear a path for the red-sailed giants. The eastern Indian Ocean has become a Ming lake, a space where the emperor's peace is the law of the land, and the treasure ships are the guardians of that peace. As the years of the third expedition draw to a close, the fleet carries more than just ivory, gems, and spices. It carries a new understanding of the world's geography and its diverse peoples. The scribes on board, like Ma Huan and Fei Xin, spend their evenings by the light of flickering lanterns, recording the customs, the languages, and the religions of the lands they have visited. They write of the great mosque of Calicut, the intricate shadow puppets of Java, and the strange, long-necked animals seen in the distant markets. These journals will eventually become the window through which the people of the Middle Kingdom view the world, turning the barbarian lands of the West into places of wonder and legitimate study. The expansion of the tribute system under Zheng He's command is a masterpiece of soft power backed by the silent threat of the iron fist. It is a system that values the ritual of submission over the brutality of conquest. By bringing foreign kings to the capital, the Ming court creates a theatre of the world where every ruler plays a part in the grand story of the Yongle emperor's benevolence. The captives from Ceylon, eventually released and sent home with gifts after showing proper contrition, return to their lands as walking advertisements for Ming mercy. This cycle of defiance, capture and forgiveness serves to solidify the Admiral's reputation as a figure of almost mythical proportions, a man who can command the winds and the tides, and who can humble kings without destroying their kingdoms. And so, as the third expedition nears its end, the treasure fleet prepares for its triumphant return. The hulls are heavy with the wealth of the world, and the hearts of the men are full of the stories they will tell their grandchildren in the quiet villages of China. The prestige of the Ming has reached its zenith in the east, but the horizon still calls. The Admiral knows that beyond the familiar ports of India lie even more distant shores, lands of red sand and golden deserts,
where the sun burns hotter and the secrets are even deeper. But for now the fleet turns its gaze toward the north, following the stars back to the heart of the empire, leaving behind a world that has been forever changed by the passing of the great wooden dragons. The ocean remains a constant companion, its vast, rhythmic breathing a mirror to the steady pulse of the fleet itself. The creaking of the massive rudders and the snapping of the silk banners create a symphony of exploration, a sound that signifies the peak of a golden age.
In the quiet moments of the night watch, as the moon reflects off the dark, rolling waves, one can almost feel the weight of history being written in the wake of the ships. The Ming court is no longer an isolated fortress, but the center of a vast, interconnected world. A world where the Admiral of the Western Seas moves with the grace of a diplomat and the authority of a god. The journey is far from over, but the foundations of a maritime empire have been laid, stone by stone, port by port, in the warm, salt-thick air of the southern sun. The scent of the air begins to change as the fleet leaves the lush, humid coastlines of India behind, trading the heavy perfume of sandalwood and cardamom for a sharper, drier breeze that carries the ancient secrets of the desert. It is the winter of 1413, and the horizon ahead is no longer a fringe of emerald palm trees, but a vast, shimmering expanse of sapphire water that leads toward the edge of the known world. For the first 3 voyages, the great treasure fleet had treated the tip of the Indian subcontinent as its ultimate destination, a natural terminus where the currents of the east met the markets of the west. But the Admiral is a man driven by a quiet, persistent curiosity, and the Ming Emperor's ambitions have grown with every successful return of the ships. The decision is made to push further, to venture beyond the familiar ports of Calicut and Cochin, and to steer the massive wooden hulls across the Arabian Sea. As the ships glide deeper into these less travelled waters, the rhythm of life on board settles into a meditative trance. The creaking of the teak timbers becomes a heartbeat, steady and reassuring, while the vast, rectangular sails of red silk catch the steady breath of the winter monsoon. There is a profound stillness in the middle of the ocean, a place where the sky and the water seem to merge into a single, infinite blue veil. The sailors watch the stars with a renewed intensity, for these are the celestial maps that will guide them toward the Persian Gulf. They navigate by the light of the North Star, which hangs lower in the sky as they move, and by the intricate calculations of the scholars who sit in the quiet cabins surrounded by scrolls and compasses, charting a course through the liquid silence. And so the fleet moves toward the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow gateway where the rugged mountains of Persia look across the water at the golden sands of Arabia. As the ships round the jagged coastline, the city of Hormuz reveals itself like a jewel resting on a bed of dry earth. It is a place of startling contrasts, a legendary trading hub where the wealth of 3 continents flows through narrow, bustling streets. To the eyes of the Chinese sailors, accustomed to the green river valleys of the Yangtze, the landscape is stark and alien, yet undeniably beautiful. The heat is a dry, physical presence, and the sunlight reflects off the whitewashed walls of the city with a brilliance that makes the eyes ache. Hormuz is a city of merchants and poets, a place where the air is thick with the smell of roasting meats, expensive resins, and the salty tang of the harbour. It is said that if the world were a ring, Hormuz would be the stone set within it. Here, the Admiral finds a society that is sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and deeply rooted in the traditions of the Islamic world. The arrival of the treasure fleet is a spectacle unlike anything the inhabitants have ever witnessed. Imagine the sight from the shore, dozens of ships, some as large as floating cathedrals, their multicoloured banners snapping in the wind, dropping anchor in the turquoise waters of the Gulf. The sheer scale of the Ming presence is a silent declaration of power, yet Zheng He approaches the city not as a conqueror, but as a guest of immense dignity.
The diplomatic exchange begins with a slow, deliberate grace. The Admiral steps onto the sun-drenched docks, his tall stature and commanding presence softened by the refined manners of the Ming court. He brings with him gifts that are designed to dazzle the senses and signify the cultural height of the Middle Kingdom. There are bolts of silk so fine they feel like water in the hand, patterned with dragons and peonies in shades of vermilion and gold. There are vessels of blue and white porcelain, their glaze as smooth as polished ice, and delicate carvings of jade that seem to glow with an inner light. In return, the rulers of Hormuz offer the treasures of the West, radiant pearls harvested from the depths of the Persian Gulf, vibrant purple dyes, and the fine-spirited horses of the desert, whose coats shimmer like silk under the sun. This encounter is more than a simple trade of goods. It is a meeting of two great civilizations, a bridge built across thousands of miles of ocean.
The Timurid Empire, which holds sway over much of the region, recognizes in the Ming delegation a power that mirrors its own architectural and intellectual grandeur. The Admiral, himself a man of faith, moves through the Islamic world with a deep, intuitive understanding of its customs. He visits the mosques and the markets, observing the way the call to prayer echoes over the rooftops at dusk, a haunting, melodic sound that blends with the gentle lapping of the tide against the hulls of his ships. There is a sense of mutual respect, a recognition that despite the vast distances and the differences in language, both empires value order, beauty, and the pursuit of knowledge. As the weeks pass in Hormuz, the scholars and translators aboard the fleet are busy recording every detail of this new world. They write of the strange and wonderful animals they encounter, the lions and the leopards, and the majestic ostriches that roam the dry plains. They marvel at the ingenuity of the local people, who have mastered the art of living in a land where water is more precious than gold. The markets are a sensory feast, filled with heaps of dried fruits, intricate woven carpets, and the intoxicating scent of frankincense and myrrh. The sailors, wandering through these bazaars, find themselves in a labyrinth of stories, where every merchant has a tale of a distant oasis or a hidden mountain kingdom. The nights in the Persian Gulf are cool and crystalline, the sky crowded with more stars than one could ever hope to count. From the deck of his treasure ship, the Admiral looks out over the quiet harbour, watching the lanterns of the city twinkle like fallen stars. He knows that his presence here has shifted the geography of the world. The map of the Ming Empire now stretches across the Indian Ocean and into the heart of the Middle East. The connections being forged in these quiet conversations and formal ceremonies will ripple through time, opening paths for pilgrims, traders, and explorers for generations to come. Meanwhile, the diplomatic missions extend beyond the city walls. Envoys from the Timurid court are invited aboard the flagship, where they are treated to banquets that last until the early hours of the morning. They sit on embroidered cushions, surrounded by the quiet elegance of Chinese lanterns, tasting delicacies that have travelled thousands of miles in the ship's holds. They discuss philosophy, astronomy, and the art of governance, finding common ground in the shared human desire to understand the stars and the seas. These exchanges are the heartbeat of the fourth voyage, a testament to the idea that the greatest treasures are not always gold or silver, but the bonds of friendship and the expansion of the mind. As the fleet prepares to weigh anchor and begin the long journey home, the atmosphere is one of quiet satisfaction. The mission has been a triumph of navigation and diplomacy. They have reached the gates of the West and found them open. The ships are now heavier, their holds filled with exotic animals, precious stones, and the envoys of distant kings who wish to pay their respects to the Son of Heaven in Nanjing. The return journey will be long, but the path is now familiar, a road of water that the Admiral has claimed for his emperor. The departure from Hormuz is a slow, majestic procession. One by one, the great ships turn their bows toward the open sea, their sails unfurling like the wings of giant birds. The city fades into a shimmering haze of heat and dust until only the tallest minarets are visible against the horizon. The Admiral stands at the stern, his gaze fixed on the receding coastline. He has seen the wonders of the desert and the riches of the Gulf, and he carries the memory of them back to the green valleys of his home. The fourth voyage has pushed the boundaries of the known, proving that the ocean is not a barrier, but a highway, a vast and fluid space where the world comes together in a slow, rhythmic dance of discovery. As the fleet moves back across the Arabian Sea, the water remains calm, a mirror for the drifting clouds. The sound of the waves is a gentle lullaby, a soft repetitive shushing that eases the mind into a state of deep peace. The journey is far from over, but the weight of the unknown has been lifted. The Admiral of the Western Seas has navigated the currents of both water and politics, weaving a tapestry of connection that spans the breadth of the world. And in the quiet of the night, as the ships glide through the dark, the only sound is the wind in the rigging, a soft whispering song of the sea that carries the fleet toward the dawn. The scent of the air begins to change as the fleet moves further south and west, losing the heavy, humid sweetness of the Spice Islands and replacing it with something drier, something redolent of ancient earth and sun-baked stone. The stars above shift their positions, guiding the great wooden hulls toward the Horn of Africa, where the deep blue of the Indian Ocean meets the vibrant, bustling shores of the Swahili coast. This is a world of coral stone cities and ivory gates, a place where the monsoon winds have facilitated trade for centuries, yet even these seasoned merchants have never seen anything quite like the arrival of the treasure fleet. As the ships drop anchor off the coast of Mogadishu, the sight is nothing short of celestial. The towering masts, some rising over 100 feet into the air, appear like a floating forest against the horizon. The people of the city-states, Mogadishu, Brava, and Malindi, gather at the water's edge, watching as the massive rudders are raised and the smaller, more agile boats are lowered to ferry the Admiral's envoys to the shore. There is a profound sense of mutual curiosity. To the Chinese sailors, these African cities are sophisticated hubs of ambergris, gold, and fine textiles. To the African rulers, the Chinese represent a distant, almost mythical power from the East, arriving not to conquer with the sword, but to impress with the sheer magnitude of their presence. The Admiral, Zheng He, steps onto the African soil with a quiet dignity, his robes of fine silk catching the coastal breeze. He brings with him the prestige of the Ming Dynasty, and with that prestige comes a delicate dance of diplomacy. In these encounters, the exchange of gifts is a language of its own. The Chinese offer porcelain as thin as eggshells and silks that shimmer like the surface of a lake, while the local sultans and governors respond with the treasures of their own land. But among the gold and the ivory, it is the living treasures that capture the imagination of the fleet and, eventually, the heart of the emperor back in the Forbidden City. It is in the kingdom of Malindi that a truly extraordinary creature is presented to the Admiral. Imagine the scene as a tall, slender animal is led toward the docks, its neck reaching toward the palm fronds, its coat a mosaic of burnt orange and cream. To the Chinese eyes, this creature is not merely a giraffe. They see in its gentle gait, its antler-like ossicones, and its peaceful nature the physical manifestation of the Qilin, a mythical beast of legend that is said to appear only during the reign of an exceptionally wise and virtuous ruler. The Qilin is a symbol of cosmic harmony, a creature so benevolent that its feet do not even crush the grass as it walks. The excitement among the crew is palpable, yet it is a quiet, reverent kind of wonder. They believe they are witnessing a miracle, a sign from the heavens that the Yongle Emperor possesses the mandate of heaven. The Giraffe is carefully hoisted onto one of the specially designed horse ships, where stables have been prepared with soft bedding and ample supplies of acacia leaves and fresh water. Beside it, the fleet collects other wonders of the African plains, striped zebras, fierce lions, and long-necked ostriches. Each animal is a living testament to the vastness of the world the Admiral has mapped, a collection of curiosities that will transform the Imperial gardens into a microcosm of the known universe. As the fleet lingers in these African ports, the impact of Chinese prestige begins to ripple through the city-states. This is not the heavy-handed influence of a colonizer, but rather a soft power that weaves its way into the local consciousness. The sultans of Mogadishu and Malindi recognize the benefits of being aligned with such a formidable maritime power. They send their own ambassadors back with the fleet, men dressed in fine linens who carry messages of friendship and submission to the dragon throne. These envoys stand on the decks of the treasure ships, looking back at their receding coastlines, perhaps feeling a mixture of trepidation and awe at the journey that lies ahead of them, a journey across thousands of miles of open water, to a land they have only heard of in whispers. The presence of the fleet brings a sense of security and stability to the region. For a brief moment in history, the Indian Ocean becomes a unified space, a corridor of exchange where ideas, faiths, and goods flow as freely as the currents. In the quiet evenings, as the sun dips below the African horizon and paints the sky in shades of violet and gold, the Chinese sailors and the African merchants sit together in the marketplaces. They share stories through translators, comparing the stars they navigate by and the legends of the deep. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and exotic incense, a sensory bridge between two worlds that had, until now, existed in relative isolation from one another. There is a rhythmic quality to the life of the fleet during these months. The creaking of the timber, the snapping of the sails, and the steady pulse of the tides create a backdrop of constant motion. Yet, within this movement, there is a profound stillness. The Admiral often retreats to his cabin to study his charts, reflecting on the distance they have travelled and the connections they have forged. He understands that these animal gifts, especially the Keelin, are more than just biological curiosities. They are political tools, symbols that will solidify the Emperor's standing and justify the immense cost of these voyages. The Giraffe, standing tall in its hold, becomes a focal point of the ship's daily life. The sailors treat it with a gentle respect, marvelling at its long lashes and the way it watches the ocean with large, dark eyes. It is a passenger from a different world, a silent witness to the ambition of the Ming Dynasty. As the fleet prepares to turn back toward the east, leaving the African coast behind, they carry with them not just crates of spices and jewels, but a piece of the African spirit. The city-states of the Swahili coast watch the white sails vanish into the haze, knowing that their place in the world has been forever altered by the arrival of the giants from the east. And so, the return journey begins, the ships heavy with the weight of their treasures and the responsibility of transporting these delicate lives across the sea. The monsoon winds, once their adversary, now become their allies, pushing them steadily back toward the familiar waters of the Malacca Strait. The ocean remains a vast, shifting expanse, but it no longer feels quite so empty. Every league of water crossed is a thread in a growing web of human connection. The Admiral looks out over the bow, his mind already moving forward to the moment the fleet will sail up the Yangtze. The sight of the Keelin rising above the deck to greet the crowds of Nanjing, a living proof that the ends of the earth are no longer a mystery, but a destination. The nights on the open sea are long and silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of the fleet. The animals in the holds settle into the sway of the ships, their wild instincts hushed by the steady movement of the waves. In this suspended state between the coast of Africa and the shores of China, the world feels small and interconnected, a single tapestry woven from the threads of countless cultures.
The Admiral of the Western Seas has not just moved ships, he has moved the boundaries of the possible, turning the terrifying unknown into a garden of earthly delights, where even the most exotic creature finds a place in the story of a unified world.
Deep within the belly of the great treasure ship, far beneath the snap of the silk sails and the call of the watchman, there is a quiet world of ink, paper, and careful observation. While the soldiers stand guard and the diplomats prepare their speeches, a small group of scholars sits huddled over low tables, their brushes moving in rhythmic, fluid strokes. They are the keepers of the fleet's memory, the men tasked with translating the vast, undulating chaos of the ocean into the orderly precision of a scroll. In these quiet moments, the movement of the ship becomes a cradle for the mind, allowing the thinkers of the Ming court to document a world that had, until now, existed only in the hazy realm of legend. The most enduring fruit of this labor is the Mao Kun map, a masterpiece of early cartography that stretches across 40 pages of delicate paper. It does not look like the maps we know today. It is not a bird's-eye view of land masses, but rather a long continuous ribbon of experience. To look upon it is to follow the very path of the Admiral himself. It is a map of movement, a guide for the soul as much as the navigator. The coastline of Southeast Asia, the jagged teeth of the Arabian Peninsula, and the distant reaches of Africa are laid out in a strip, punctuated by the stars that guided them. Here the scholars recorded the star paths, noting exactly which constellations should sit above the horizon to ensure a safe passage. They captured the rhythm of the monsoons and the hidden dangers of the coral reefs, turning the terrifying, trackless sea into a series of predictable steps. As the ink dried on these pages, the world became a slightly more intimate place, a space where a sailor could find his way home simply by reading the language of the sky. Beyond the stars and the coastlines, the fleet's scholars were deeply occupied with the living wonders of the earth. They were not merely travellers, they were the first true global naturalists. Each time the fleet anchored in a new port, these men would descend into the local markets and forests, their eyes wide with a quiet, scholarly hunger. They collected seeds, pressed flowers between silk sheets, and sketched the anatomy of creatures that seemed to defy the logic of the Middle Kingdom. They studied the medicinal properties of frankincense and myrrh in the markets of Ormuz, noting how the resin wept from the bark of the trees like golden tears. They observed the behavior of the ostrich and the zebra, trying to find names for animals that had never been seen in the temperate valleys of the Yangtze. In their journals, they wrote of the qilin, the mythical beast we now know as the giraffe, describing its long, elegant neck and its gentle, spotted coat with a sense of profound spiritual awe. To these scholars, science was not a cold or detached pursuit. It was a way of honoring the harmony of the universe. By documenting the diversity of life, they believed they were witnessing the boundless creativity of the heavens. They recorded the different ways people farmed, the strange and beautiful languages spoken in the ports of the Swahili coast, and the intricate social structures of the Indian kingdoms. This was a grand botanical and zoological census of the known world, conducted with a patience and a precision that would not be matched for centuries. The air in their cabins must have been thick with the scent of drying herbs and the quiet scratch of bamboo pens, a sanctuary of knowledge floating upon the salt spray of the Indian Ocean. As the fleet moved through the water, it carried with it the pinnacle of Ming technology, a legacy of innovation that whispered of a world far ahead of its time. The treasure ships were marvels of engineering, featuring watertight compartments that could keep a vessel afloat even if the hull was breached, a concept that would not become standard in Western shipbuilding for hundreds of years. They used sophisticated magnetic compasses, balanced in gimbals to remain level despite the rolling of the waves, and they measured their speed with weighted lines and rhythmic chants. There is a certain peace in imagining these great wooden giants, their hulls reinforced with tropical hardwoods, and their rudders as tall as houses, gliding effortlessly through storms that would have swallowed lesser fleets. This was the pre-Columbian world at its most technologically daring. The Ming navigators possessed a deep understanding of the Earth's curvature and the seasonal shifts of the winds, a body of knowledge that was passed down through generations of coastal sailors and refined in the Imperial academies. This technology was not used for conquest in the way later empires would use it. Instead, it was used to create a bridge of understanding. The legacy of these ships lies in the way they transformed the ocean from a barrier into a highway. They proved that the world was not a collection of isolated islands, but a single, breathing entity, connected by the same currents and watched over by the same stars. As the night deepens and the fleet continues its steady journey across the dark water, one can almost feel the weight of all that gathered knowledge. It is a heavy, comforting presence. The scrolls tucked away in lacquer boxes, the jars of rare spices, the detailed drawings of distant ports. The scholars eventually close their inkstones and blow out their lamps, leaving the ships to be guided by the silent, shimmering maps of the heavens. The legacy of the Admiral's fleet is not just found in the gold or the silk they traded, but in this quiet victory of the human mind, the moment when the unknown became known, and the vastness of the sea was finally captured in the gentle curve of a scholar's brush. The ocean remains vast, yes, but it is no longer empty. It is filled with the names of stars, the shapes of distant mountains, and the memory of a fleet that dared to measure the world. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most formidable ambitions, and as the year 1431 dawns, the air in the shipyards of Nanjing carries a different weight, a sense of finality mixed with a quiet, enduring resolve. The Admiral is now an older man, his hair perhaps silvered like the crests of the waves he has spent a lifetime mastering, yet his gaze remains fixed upon the horizon where the sky meets the salt spray. After a period of quietude and internal shifts within the Imperial court, the new Xuanda Emperor has looked once more toward the sea, commissioning a seventh and final voyage that would dwarf those that came before in both scale and spirit. This journey is not merely a mission of trade or diplomacy. It feels like a grand summation, a final gathering of the winds before the sails are tucked away forever. Over 100 ships are prepared, carrying more than 27,000 souls, each one a thread in a tapestry that has been weaving itself across the Indian Ocean for nearly 30 years. As the fleet moves out past the familiar coastlines, the rhythm of the oars and the creak of the teak hulls feel like a heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, and deeply familiar to the man who has commanded them through storms and stillness alike. They travel the well-worn paths to Champa, Java, and Malacca, but there is a lingering sense that they are pushing towards something more profound this time. The Admiral, though his body may feel the ache of the damp sea air more than it once did, leads with a grace that has been refined by decades of command. He understands now that the ocean is not an enemy to be conquered, but a vast, breathing entity to be respected, and his seventh voyage reflects this quiet wisdom. The fleet eventually divides, as it often does, sending smaller squadrons like silver needles to stitch together the far corners of the known world. One such group sails toward the Red Sea, guided by the stars and the ancient knowledge of the pilots. They reach the port of Jeddah, where the air is thick with the scent of dry earth and the heat of the desert sun. From here, a group of the Admiral's men travels inland to the holy city of Mecca. It is a moment of profound spiritual resonance for Zheng He, a man born into a Muslim family in the mountains of Yunnan, who has spent his life serving a Buddhist emperor and navigating the diverse religious landscapes of the southern seas. Though he may not have walked the sands of Mecca himself during this journey, his representatives carry his spirit there, documenting the magnificent architecture and the hushed, sacred atmosphere of the Kaaba. They return with tales of a world that feels both ancient and eternal, bringing back gifts and knowledge that bridge the gap between the Middle Kingdom and the cradle of the faith. The ships linger in these western reaches, the furthest they would ever venture. They watch the sun dip behind the rugged mountains of the African coast and the Arabian peninsula, the water turning a deep, bruised purple in the twilight. The sailors trade silk for exotic animals, for incense that smells of ancient forests, and for stories that they will carry back to the tea-houses of China. Yet, as the fleet begins its long turn back toward the east, a shadow falls over the flagship. The Admiral's health, long sustained by his indomitable will, begins to flicker like a candle in a draughty corridor. It is said that near the coast of Calicut, the very place where his journey into the deep ocean truly began decades earlier, Zheng He's strength finally begins to ebb. The year is 1433, and the air is warm and humid, smelling of the spices that have made this port a jewel of the world. He lies in his cabin, the gentle rocking of the great treasure ship, acting as a cradle, the sound of the water against the hull a constant, soothing lullaby. Perhaps he thinks back to the boy he once was, standing in the shadow of the Himalayas, or to the young commander who first saw the terrifying beauty of a typhoon. His life has been a long, winding river that finally found its way to the sea, and now that sea is calling him home. The passing of the Admiral is not a moment of chaos, but one of profound, heavy silence. The fleet, usually a bustling city of activity, grows quiet as the news spreads from deck to deck. The great Admiral of the Western Seas, the man who had seen the ends of the earth and returned with the world in his pockets, has reached his final destination. There is a deep, poetic symmetry in his departure occurring at sea, far from the gilded cages of the Imperial court, surrounded by the wooden walls and the salt air that had become his true home. In accordance with the traditions of the sea and the solemnity of his rank, it is widely believed that Zheng He was given a burial in the waves he loved so dearly. There is no grand marble tomb for him on land, no stationary monument that can be weathered by the wind or forgotten by the shifting sands of politics. Instead, his body is committed to the deep, blue silence of the Indian Ocean. As the weighted shroud slips beneath the surface, the water ripples and then settles, returning to that perfect, glass-like stillness that he had navigated so many times before. He becomes a part of the very maps he helped to draw, his memory dissolving into the currents that flow from the coast of Africa to the shores of the Yellow Sea. The fleet continues its journey back to China, but the atmosphere has changed. The sails seem to hang a little heavier, and the songs of the sailors are sung in a lower key. They carry with them his journals, his charts, and the countless treasures he gathered, but the heart of the expedition has been left behind in the deep. When they finally arrive at the mouth of the Yangtze, the sight of the familiar green hills and the bustling docks of home brings a bittersweet relief. They have returned, but they have left their leader in the vast emerald embrace of the southern seas. Back in Nanjing, a symbolic tomb is constructed on the slopes of Cattlehead Hill. It is a beautiful, quiet place, with stone steps and carvings of the waves, a cenotaph where his clothes and his headgear are laid to rest so that his family and his country might have a place to honor him. But the people know, the sailors know, that the true Admiral is not there. He is in the whisper of the wind through the rigging, in the silver light of the moon on a calm sea, and in the steady, unchanging guidance of the North Star. As the ships are moored and the men return to their families, the era of the great voyages begins to slowly, almost imperceptibly, draw to a close. The logs are filed away in the Imperial archives, the great hulls begin to gather barnacles in the quiet harbours, and the memory of the fleet starts to transition from living history into the realm of legend. The seventh voyage was the longest, the largest, and the most poignant, serving as a final grand gesture of a Ming Dynasty that briefly looked outward with curiosity and courage before turning its gaze back to the safety of its own borders. The ocean remains, of course, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, untouched by the passing of even the greatest men. But for a few decades it was navigated by a man who saw no boundaries, only horizons. Zheng He's final journey was not just a return to China, but a return to the elements, a peaceful surrender to the vastness that he had spent his life trying to understand. And as the lanterns are dimmed on the last of the returning ships, the sea continues its eternal rise and fall, cradling the memory of the Admiral in its deep, rhythmic breathing. Moving through the quiet corridors of time, we see that the end of a journey is rarely just a stopping point. It is a transformation. The Admiral's death was not the end of his influence, but the beginning of his immortality in the stories of the people. Even as the Ming court began to burn the records and let the ships rot, the coastal villages kept his name alive, whispering stories of the three-jewel eunuch who brought the world to their doorstep. In the silence of the night, when the tide comes in and the water laps against the shore, one can almost hear the phantom creak of 1,000 wooden planks, the ghostly echo of a fleet that once turned the entire ocean into a garden of discovery. The ink on the official scrolls was still wet when the winds of change began to blow through the corridors of the Forbidden City, moving not with the salt spray of the ocean, but with the scent of old paper and the dry dust of inland plains. As the seventh and final voyage reached its conclusion, a profound stillness settled over the shipyards of Nanjing. The great dry docks, which had once hummed with the rhythmic thud of 10,000 hammers and the shouts of master shipwrights, began to fall silent. It was as if the empire itself was holding its breath, exhaling the ambitions of the sea and inhaling the familiar grounded scent of the earth. The age of the horizon was fading, replaced by an era of boundaries, as the scholar officials, the mandarins who had long viewed the treasure fleet as a wasteful extravagance, finally tightened their grip on the heart of the Ming administration. These men of letters and Confucian tradition looked upon the ocean not as a gateway to wonder, but as a chaotic void that offered little to the Middle Kingdom. To them, the vast expenditures required to maintain the wooden leviathans were better spent on the tangible security of the soil. They argued that China was the center of the world, self-sufficient and supreme, and that the trinkets of distant lands, the spices, the exotic woods, the giraffes and lions, were merely curiosities that distracted from the moral cultivation of the state. And so, the Great Withdrawal began, not with a sudden bang, but with the quiet scratching of brushes across parchment as decree after decree slowly dismantled the greatest maritime legacy the world had ever seen. The transition was a slow, melancholic folding of wings. The massive treasure ships, those floating cathedrals of teak and bamboo, were moored in the quiet reaches of the Yangtze River, left to the mercy of the silt and the slow creep of decay. Without the constant care of the shipwrights, the hulls began to soften, the vibrant red lacquer flaking away like autumn leaves falling into the water. Barnacles clung to the wood that had once sliced through the waves of the Arabian Sea, and the great silk sails, which had billowed like clouds over the Indian Ocean, were taken down and folded away into dark storehouses, eventually succumbing to the slow hunger of moths and time. It is a haunting image to consider. These giants of the water, capable of carrying hundreds of men and vast wealth, slowly sinking into the mud of the riverbanks, their masts tilting toward the sky like the skeletal fingers of a forgotten era. Meanwhile, a more systematic destruction was taking place within the archives of the Imperial Palace. The scholar officials, determined to ensure that such voyages would never be repeated, began to burn the records of Zheng He's expeditions. Logbooks detailing the stars used for navigation, charts mapping the coastlines of Africa and the Persian Gulf, and the meticulous accounts of the peoples and cultures encountered were cast into the flames. The smoke from these fires carried away the hard-won knowledge of decades, turning the geography of the world back into a mystery. It was a deliberate act of forgetting, an attempt to erase the memory of the sea from the mind of the empire, so that future generations would look only inward, toward the ancestral lands and the traditional ways of life. The resources that had once fueled the shipyards were redirected toward the north, where the shadows of the nomadic tribes still loomed over the borders. The Ming emperors turned their gaze away from the shimmering blue of the Pacific and toward the rugged, golden-brown mountains of the interior. The Great Wall, which had existed in various forms for centuries, became the new focus of the empire's architectural might. Thousands of laborers, perhaps some of the very same men who had once carved the dragon heads for the treasure ships, were sent to haul stone and brick across the ridgelines. The wall grew taller and thicker, a serpentine guardian made of earth and rock, designed to keep the world out just as the ships had been designed to go out into the world. The ocean was no longer a road, it was a moat, and the empire was content to sit behind its magnificent stony shell. As the years passed into the middle of the 15th century, the laws regarding maritime activity became increasingly restrictive. The private trade that had flourished in the wake of Zheng He's voyages was suppressed under the weight of the haijin, or the sea ban. It became a crime to build a ship with more than 2 masts. It became a crime to sail beyond the sight of the coast. The vibrant port cities, once teeming with merchants from Malacca, Calicut, and Hormuz, slowed to a crawl. The sound of foreign tongues in the marketplaces grew fainter, replaced by the familiar rhythms of local trade. The empire was turning its back on the water, pulling its skirts inward and focusing on internal stability, agricultural perfection, and the rigid hierarchies of the court. There is a quiet irony in this shift, a sense of a world shrinking even as it became more secure. The scholar officials believed they were protecting the soul of China from the corrupting influences of the outside world. Yet in doing so, they were also closing the doors on the innovations and perspectives that keep a civilization vibrant. The great docks of Nanjing eventually filled with silt, becoming grassy meadows where goats grazed and children played, unaware that beneath their feet lay the rotted ribs of ships that had once visited the palaces of sultans and the shores of the Swahili coast. The knowledge of how to build such massive vessels was lost, drifting away like the smoke from the burning archives, until the treasure ships seemed less like historical reality and more like the exaggerated myths of a bygone age. Yet, even in this period of isolation, the ghost of the fleet lingered in the salt air. The sailors who had returned from the voyages lived out their lives in the coastal villages, telling stories to their grandchildren of the day the sun was eclipsed by 1,000 sails. They spoke of the phosphorescent waters of the south, of the mountains of ice in the far distance, and of the Admiral who stood like a pillar of jade upon the deck of the lead ship. These stories became the seeds of a folk memory, a hidden history that the official records could not entirely extinguish. While the court looked to the wall and the mountains, the people of the coast still looked to the horizon, waiting for a tide that would never truly return in the same way again. As the night deepens and the world grows still, we can reflect on the fragility of human ambition. The Great Withdrawal was not just a change in policy, but a change in the very spirit of an era. It was the moment when the Ming Dynasty chose the safety of the known over the splendor of the unknown. The silence that followed the fleet's destruction was profound, a long historical pause that would last for centuries. But the ocean, patient and eternal, continued to lap against the shores of China, carrying the rhythm of the waves as a reminder that the world is always there, waiting just beyond the breakers, whether we choose to sail into it or not. The era of the treasure fleet had ended, but the water remembers the weight of the timber, and the wind still carries the faint, ghostly scent of sandalwood and silk, blowing in from the deep, dark reaches of the western seas. In the quiet temples of Malacca and the coastal shrines of Java, the smell of incense curls toward the rafters, much as it did 600 years ago. It is here, in the soft glow of flickering candles, that Zheng He is no longer an admiral or a diplomat, but a figure of myth, a guardian spirit known to many as Sampo Kong. As the decades turned into centuries, the memory of the great fleet transformed from a matter of state records into the fabric of Southeast Asian folklore. In the hearts of the people along the maritime Silk Road, the treasure fleet never truly disappeared. It simply drifted into the realm of legend. The stories told to children in the cool evening air speak of a giant who brought gifts of porcelain and wisdom, a man whose presence was so profound that he was elevated to the status of a deity. In Semarang, a massive cave temple honors his arrival, where the red and gold pillars stand as silent sentinels to a history that refused to be forgotten by the common folk, even when it was scrubbed from the Imperial archives in distant Beijing. This cultural resonance is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Voyages. While the wooden hulls eventually succumbed to rot and the silk banners frayed into dust, the shared heritage of trade, migration, and mutual respect remained. The Chinese diaspora that took root in these lush, tropical lands looked back to the Admiral as a pioneer of their own journeys, a spiritual ancestor who bridged the gap between the Middle Kingdom and the vast emerald world of the Southern Islands. And so, we find ourselves reflecting on the strange, quiet tragedy of what might have been. When we hold the Ming treasure fleet against the mirror of the European age of discovery, the contrast is as striking as the moon reflected in a dark pond. Only a few decades after the last Chinese ship returned to port, small, sturdy caravels from Portugal and Spain began to round the Cape of Good Hope, venturing into the very waters Zheng He had mastered so long before. There is a profound irony in the scale of these endeavours. Christopher Columbus set sail with 3 modest ships that could have been tucked away inside the hold of a single Chinese treasure ship. Vasco da Gama commanded a handful of men, while Zheng He commanded nearly 30,000. Yet the European voyages were driven by a different hunger, a desperate need for expansion, gold and conquest that would reshape the globe in a violent, permanent upheaval. The Ming fleet, for all its overwhelming power, was an instrument of prestige and harmony, a way for the emperor to demonstrate that China was the center of a civilized world, inviting others to bask in its radiance rather than crushing them under its weight. One sought to map and claim the world, while the other sought to display that the world already belonged to a celestial order. As the European ships arrived with their cannons and their thirst for territory, the great shipyards of Nanjing lay silent, the massive dry docks filling with silt and rainwater, as if the ocean itself were reclaiming the space where the giants were born. As the years passed, the silence grew deeper. The decision to retreat inward, to burn the charts and let the ships crumble, stands as one of history's most haunting what-ifs. We can almost see the ghosts of those 9-masted ships sailing just beyond the horizon of our imagination. Imagine a world where the Ming fleet had continued its westward push, perhaps reaching the shores of the Americas or establishing a permanent presence in the Mediterranean long before the rise of the Western empires. But history is not made of what-ifs. It is made of the choices we settle upon, and the Ming chose the stability of the land over the uncertainty of the salt spray. The Great Wall was reinforced with stone, while the wooden walls of the navy were left to the mercy of the elements. The ocean, however, does not care for the edicts of emperors or the shifting whims of court politics. It remains vast, rhythmic, and indifferent to the rise and fall of dynasties. The waves that once broke against the bows of the treasure ships continue to roll across the Indian Ocean, washing over the coral reefs of the Maldives and the sandy reaches of the Swahili coast. In the deep, dark reaches of the sea, where the sunlight fades into an eternal, cool blue, there is a profound stillness. It is a stillness that mirrors the end of the Admiral's journey. Somewhere off the coast of Calicut, or perhaps on the long voyage home, Zheng He drew his final breath, his eyes closing on the very horizon he had spent his life chasing. He was a man of two worlds, a Muslim serving a Confucian court, a eunuch who became a father to a nation's maritime dreams, and a captive who became the most powerful sailor in the world. His life was a series of contradictions held together by an iron will and a vision of a world connected by water. As we drift towards sleep, we can imagine the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging of a ship that no longer exists, a low, steady hum that vibrates through the deck boards. We can feel the gentle pitch and roll of the vessel as it navigates the dark expanse of the night sea, guided by the same stars that watch over us now. The North Star, steady and bright, served as his compass, just as it serves as a reminder of the permanence of the natural world amidst the fleeting shadows of human ambition. The treasure fleet was a dream made of teak and bamboo, a floating city that carried the hopes of an empire across the waves. Though the maps were burned and the timber reclaimed by the earth, the spirit of the voyage lingers in the salty air of every port from Fuzhou to Mombasa. It lives on in the blue and white porcelain shards still found in the soil of African villages, and in the ancient tiles of the starry messenger who came from the east. The ocean is a vast library of forgotten stories, and the tale of the Admiral is one of its most beautiful chapters. A story of a time when the horizon was not a boundary, but an invitation. The water is calm now. The great fleet has passed into the mist, their sails blending with the clouds, their wakes smoothed over by the tireless tides. There is no more need for the heavy anchor or the shouting of the crew. There is only the rhythmic breathing of the sea, the slow measurement of time that transcends centuries. We are all, in some sense, travellers on a dark ocean, drifting toward the morning, carried by currents we cannot see but can certainly feel. As the last echoes of the treasure ships fade, we are left with the image of the Admiral standing at the rail, looking out over the prow at a world that was, for a brief and shining moment, within his reach. The stars are reflected in the dark water, shimmering like jewels scattered across a velvet cloth. The air is cool, smelling of salt and the distant promise of spice. The journey is over. The sails are furled and the harbour is quiet. The great wooden giants have found their rest in the depths of memory, and the ocean continues its long, slow conversation with the shore. Beneath the waves, the sand shifts and settles, covering the footprints of history with a gentle, eternal hand. Sleep now, and let the tide carry you into the vast, peaceful reaches of the western seas, where the wind is always soft and the stars are always bright, and the great fleet sails on forever in the quiet silver moonlight of the mind.